Hello, I'm Rick Howard, and I've been making these travel adventure documentaries for quite a few years now, and most of the work has been done on tropical islands. Well, the most beautiful exotic island that I've ever visited is the island of Bali in Indonesia. My first trip to Bali I spent 2 weeks, and I found out that 2 weeks on Bali is a little bit like seeing the first 10 minutes of a good movie and missing all the rest. You always wondered what you missed. I knew that someday I was going to have to return there and finish the job, but I didn't know that it would take me 5 years to work my way back. So as well as a story centered on Bali, you're going to see some of Hong Kong, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and the Philippines, all in this 5-year story that I call The Real World of Bali. The aerial approach to Hong Kong is one of the most beautiful in the world, so the pilots will usually fly you all the way around the island before landing. It gives everybody a chance to see everything. When you land, you realize you've entered a very watery world, a world of boats. That little boat there is called a sampan. These are the water taxis that transport people all over this area. They have so much water around here that they have more water taxis than the four-wheel kind. Victoria Harbor separates Hong Kong Island from the Kowloon Peninsula. Hong Kong is one of those places in the world where the old world and the new come together. You can be in many parts of downtown Hong Kong and you might think that you're in San Francisco or London or any other international city. That's until you look up one of the windy little roads in the old Wan Chai district and you can see the way Hong Kong has looked for about a century. But even when you look to the skyline in Wan Chai, you can always see the new city growing. The most impressive place to see Hong Kong from is from up on top of Victoria Peak. You can get quite a view of the whole city from up here. This was only my first stop on my way back to Bali, so the hustle and bustle of downtown Hong Kong was a little bit too much for me that day. I crossed the island to Aberdeen Fishing Village. Aberdeen is a fascinating world within a world, an entire floating community. The people here live on these large junks, and the little sampans provide transportation between them. Many of these junks go down fishing off the coast of Vietnam every year. They not only bring back fish, some of them bring back refugees, and some of them bring back opium from the Golden Triangle. The smuggling of opium is a big problem here. Quite a bit of it takes place through Aberdeen. That's because it would be virtually impossible to ever try to search these junks. That's the largest floating restaurant in the world. They have 3 of them here in Aberdeen, and this one, the Jumbo, is the biggest. Actually, it's many restaurants in one. But even the hustle and bustle of Aberdeen was a little bit too much for me that day. I decided to see the sunset at a place called Repulse Bay, the site of a Buddhist shrine. While I was watching the sunset, my imagination took me back, about 5 years into the past, and about 2,000 miles to the south, past the Philippines, Vietnam, over the large island of Borneo, to the tiny island of Bali in Indonesia, right next to the larger island of Java. My first visit here, on my final approach, I found that the airport seemed to have been cut right out of the coral reef. When we landed, like most tourists, I was immediately hustled across the island to the most expensive hotels at a place called Sanur Beach. Beautiful 5-star hotels offering whatever a tourist could possibly want. 18-hole golf courses, water sports. But I was living on a shoestring at that time, so I caught a little vehicle called a BMO, headed for Denpasar, the capital city, looking for less expensive lodging. That's a BMO. They're the little golf cart-sized buses that transport people all over this area. Not the only way to get around, though. The most fun way of getting around is to rent one of the little Japanese motorcycles here. They're very inexpensive, and they're everywhere. But to ride a motorcycle here, first you have to get an Indonesian driver's license. For riding bikes, that's not the hardest thing in the world to do. All he has to do to get his license is to stay inside the circle and not put his foot down. He really had no trouble getting his license, though. The bottom line is that if you're willing to pay for your license, they'll test you until you pass. Actually, this causes a very dangerous situation here. You have many very inexperienced motorcycle riders out on these roads crashing into each other and everything else in sight. You notice that the riders are squeezed off to about 3 feet on the left side of the road there. And nobody in Bali ever seemed to dress appropriately for motorcycle riding. They used to call Bali the island of 10,000 temples. Actually, 50,000 would be closer to the truth. Everywhere you turn on this island, you see one of these ancient Hindu temples. We're going to the only offshore temple in Bali, the Temple of Tanah. Tanah's a beautiful temple with a mythological serpent that's supposed to live underneath it. I was very lucky at Tanah. I ran into a group of Australians who had just arrived here from the land down under. They were taking their own little tour of the temples. I followed them south to the southern Bali, to the high cliff temple of Uluwatu. Uluwatu is not only the site of this beautiful temple, it's also the site of some of the finest surfing waves to be found anywhere in the world. The Australian surfers discovered them first. Soon the word got out and surfers were arriving from everywhere. As soon as we entered this temple, I thought it was deserted until the locals started showing up. It turned out that there were hundreds of monkeys living here. They started coming out in pairs to meet us. I met an old Balinese guy there that day who told me the story of why all the monkeys in Bali are sacred. There he is. And he said long ago there was a prince named Rama. Well, Rama was supposed to inherit a kingdom, but due to some inter-family squabbling, Prince Rama, his wife Sita, and his younger brother were all banished to the forest. To make matters worse, once while Rama and his brother were out hunting for a deer, Sita was captured by an evil god named Tarsikan, taken off to the island of Sri Lanka. Well, the Ramayana story is about how an army of monkeys led by one magic monkey named Hanumani were able to rescue Sita and kill the evil god Tarsikan. These monkeys on Bali are supposed to be direct descendants from Hanumani's army, so they let you know right away when you arrive here that you're a guest here and they own the place. They like to nap in the shade. If you give them a chance, they'll steal anything that they can out of your shirt pocket, like your cigarettes or sunglasses. If this happens, there's only one way to get it back. You buy a bag of peanuts and put one peanut on the ground. The monkey will pick it up. Then you put 2 peanuts down. He'll pick them up. Eventually, you'll put down enough peanuts that he'll have to put down whatever he stole, and you grab it. Believe me, that's the only way to do it. It wasn't long before I realized that even if I had had all the actors and actresses in Hollywood to choose from, I still could never have cast a film better than with this group. They were all young and full of adventure. If there was a mountain to climb or a jungle to explore, they wanted to. All I had to do was follow them for 2 weeks and film them. The first place I followed everybody was to where they were all living, a place called Kuta Beach, for some very inexpensive hotels. Torrential rains like this will start and end in a matter of moments all over Bali. Most people just look for cover. Around 3 or 4 in the afternoon, everybody here takes a siesta. It gets them out of the hottest part of the day. In the next few weeks, we became fascinated with the Balinese people. They have a very interesting lifestyle. Many of them make their living from the sea, or they grow 3 rice crops a year. If you're the firstborn in a Balinese family, your name is Wayan. If you're the second-born, your name is Made. Third-born, your name is Yeoman, and fourth-born, your name is Katuk. And if you're the fifth-born, you go back to Wayan again. That's whether you're a boy or a girl, so obviously there are a lot of Balinese with the same first names. There are many hidden dangers here. When you step off the plane in a place like this, you smell the fragrant flowers and feel the warm air, and it might lull you into a false sense of security. You can ignore the dangers, but I'm going to introduce you to a few of them here. One danger is the friendly-looking little dogs that will walk up to your table at the outdoor restaurants anxious to beg table scraps. But don't be fooled, these are not the dogs from back home. Hunger is a problem all over Asia, and anytime people have a problem, their animals have that problem worse. These dogs really live a life of combat with each other here at night. But no sooner will you see something like this that will shock you, you can turn your head and see something else that will enchant you like this. Like the first time that I saw one of these processions. Many of them were carrying a sheet high above their heads. And the whole group was being followed by a little musical group called a gamelan orchestra. I wanted to follow and see where they were all going, but we were already on our way to the Bat Temple, so I was outvoted by my friends. Animals are sacred to the Hindus. The Hindus believe that every animal has a soul and therefore an equal right to life. In many Hindu countries, cows are considered to be reincarnated people. But at this particular place, the bats are sacred because this is the Bat Temple. Naturally, it's in front of the Bat Cave. Now, since they're sacred, nobody bothers them, so they don't mind if I walk right up and get these close-up shots. That squeaky sound that you hear is their sonar system. They emit that high-pitch impulse and it bounces off of hard objects. Then they catch it back in their radar dish-shaped ears. This enables them to fly in the dark without running into anything. At the Bat Temple that day, I met somebody that I knew back from Kuta Beach. I had met a guy back there named Wayan. He had a family of 5 daughters and 1 son. Well, Yeoman, his 13-year-old daughter, was at the Bat Temple that day. She told me that if I would give her a ride back home, she would tell me an interesting story about this salt village on the other side of the road from the Bat Temple. This is one of the villages where they collect salt for the other Balinese villages. Bali is a very communal existence. Well, Yeoman turned out to be quite a storyteller. She's 13 years old, and she told me that back when this was Dutch Indonesia, the Dutch missionaries had quite a problem here with the Balinese women. You see, Bali has always been the island where the women wore nothing above the waist. Well, this didn't sit too well with the Dutch missionaries, but they had had no luck at all trying to change these people, so they decided to sort of trick them. They sent back to Europe for hundreds of yards of white Muslim cloth to be sent out, and they worked feverishly for a couple of weeks to make white pullover shirts for all the women here. They presented these shirts as gifts just before the rainy season, knowing that it would be an insult to refuse a gift. Well, the women accepted the gifts, and the missionaries celebrated having gotten their own way. That's right up until the next morning. It seems that all the women had cut 2 holes in their shirts in order to nurse their children. Well, as you can see, they still haven't changed their ways out in the villages. In the large city, they dressed up mainly for the sake of the tourist. But out here, they live life the way that they always have. Naturally, anytime you find a place in the world where the locals do something, the tourists will join in. That's all I'm going to show you, though. If you like riding your bike off the road, Bali's a very good place to come. You can ride off the road here, actually, almost anywhere. I think it's probably safer off the roads than it is on most of them. This was a common sight off the road here in Bali. My first trip to Bali, most of the roads look like this. That's a big part of the problem. When I got back to the Bamboo Inn that day, I found that all my Australian friends had crashed. These are motorcycle burns on their legs. I was the only one who hadn't run into something that day. That's the sick and hidden danger I wanted to tell you about. Don't ever try to learn to ride a motorcycle in a place like this. The third hidden danger is possibly the most dangerous of all. Not everybody wants to ride a motorcycle, but almost everybody has to eat frequently. Some people come from many parts of the world here to try the exotic cuisine off the menu. Sometimes they order something that sounds exotic just because it sounds exotic. This is not a good thing to do in the case of the blue meanie mushrooms. They contain a hallucinogenic drug called psilocybin, which is illegal in most parts of the world, but it's not in Indonesia, so you can order them right off the menu here. The real danger is that somebody will order something off the menu not really knowing what they're getting into, and they'll run into a few of the mythological creatures that are supposed to haunt the forests around here. Don't ever be afraid to ask a lot of questions here. There aren't as many rules to protect people from themselves, so you have to be very inquisitive. We were headed for the Sangi monkey forest, and again I heard that familiar sound. Another one of those processions was passing. Well, again I wanted to follow, but again I was outvoted by all my friends. We were on our way to the Sangi monkey forest. I decided that the next time I saw one of these, I'd follow it for sure. The Sangi monkey forest is a place where the monkeys own and control everything. Actually, they're related to us more like a little tribe of people than wild animals. You give them a chance, they'll jump up on your shirt pocket and grab anything they can out of it like that. But they'll also organize little games to play with you. You don't want to abuse one of these monkeys, though. If you throw a rock at one, for example, the rest of them might organize a little posse and chase you out of here. Their temple is right in the center of the forest. These are supposed to be the most sacred monkeys on Bali. The reason for this is, back when the magic monkey Hanuman had to kill the evil god Tarsigan, he had a problem. Tarsigan could not be killed on the land, on the sea, or in the air, which didn't leave many possibilities. But Hanuman had the ability to grow as large as he wanted, so he grew big enough to pick up a mountain and smother Tarsigan inside the mountain, which he did. But when he picked up the mountain, one of his army of monkeys was on that mountain, and they fell all here in the Sangi forest. So these are the most sacred monkeys. We're high up in the mountains now, headed for one of the two volcanoes that built Bali, Kintamani volcano. First, we're going to have to hire a boat to take us across that lake, but then we can actually walk up the lava flow to the spot where Kintamani is a new stage of an eruption, right where that plume of volcanic gas is escaping there. But first we had to hire the biggest boat we could find, since there were so many of us. It was about a 20-minute paddle across the lake. We got about halfway out there and we realized that our boat was leaking. We got some rice paper and squeezed it into the holes. That didn't seem to help at all. Then one of us finally told the boatman that we were leaking. He said, "That's no problem." He said, "There's a coffee can under one of the seats. One of you bail and the rest of you paddle." I asked him why he hadn't told us that his boat leaked. He said, "Well, you wouldn't have rented it." Paddle across the lake, and then about a 5-hour hike up the lava flow. But once we got up there, it was worth the effort. It was a fascinating place. The ground was hot and rumbling. The air was filled with volcanic gas. Here's the edge of the volcano. Watch Todd almost fall in here. All the way down 100 feet to the molten rocks below. Most places in the world you couldn't get anywhere near this close to an erupting volcano, but in Bali, if you're willing to spend your money and rent the boat, you can walk anywhere you want. Once in a while it would be a roar, and a plume of volcanic gas like this would go hundreds of feet into the air. It made us feel like the volcano was going to explode under us right at that moment. We also found out that you're not supposed to breathe volcanic gas. Interesting that only about a mile away from that inferno is this rice-terraced hill, the backside of the volcano. And that was my first trip to Bali. As you can see, I only saw a small part of this island. I never did find out what one of those processions was, and I hadn't even had a chance to go surfing. I decided right then that I was going to have to come back here someday and make a complete film. I didn't know then that it was going to take me 5 years to work my way back. I watched the sunset that evening on Kuta Beach with my Australian friends. Kuta is one of the places in Asia that's known for its sunsets. When the sun sets here, it paints the whole sky red on its way down. I time-lapsed one of them so you can see the whole sunset, and you can also see what the world looks like when it's moving 100 times faster than normal. Well, back in our time machine, back to the future, and back to Repulse Bay in Hong Kong for a time-lapse sunset here. The next morning I was on a plane headed for Singapore. I was flying down to Singapore to pick up a box of film there that I was going to use in an underwater film job in the Philippines. If I had sent the film directly to the Philippines where I needed to get it, it probably would have been impounded by customs and I never would have received it. But by sending the film to Singapore, I could pick it up there and take it to the Philippines. That's how you have to do business in Southeast Asia. You have to fly all over to the different countries, obeying all their laws, and somehow trying to get your job done. On the way to Singapore, I was flying along the coast of Vietnam, and I was looking out the airplane window. Again, my imagination took me back about 3 years into the past to the steaming jungles of the Golden Triangle. I had returned to the mountains of Thailand to film the Aka tribe, the Yao tribe, and the Li Su people. I had filmed them 3 years earlier, and I came back now to finish the job. This time we walked right into the middle of the opium harvest. This is where 80% of Asia's opium is grown every year. During January and February, this is harvest season. You can't steal an opium field. There's millions of dollars of raw opium growing here. Only when it's harvested and loaded on mule trains is it a danger, because you can steal a mule train. This causes the annual opium war here every year. Well, my partner and I walked right into the middle of it. The real danger was getting my film out. This is what I carry on tour with me, 50 100-foot rolls of 16mm movie film. Well, I had to take these sealed film cans all the way from the center of the Golden Triangle to Los Angeles, unopened during opium season. If any customs agents had wanted to search me, they wouldn't have found any drugs, but they would have exposed the movie to the light and ruined it. So even though we weren't smugglers, we had to find the smugglers' route out. This meant avoiding all the main roads where customs agents and soldiers would be searching luggage. We turned to the canals here, the little klongs that crisscross their way all over Thailand. We traveled on the long-tail boats. Further south, we transferred to a train, and we are actually on a railroad known to the world as the Death Railroad. This is the railroad that goes over the bridge on the River Kwai from World War II fame. It's easy to see how it got its name. Could you imagine trying to build a railroad here under the gun of the Japanese, being plagued by malaria, dysentery, dengue fever? The bridge is still here. Well, I thought when I transferred into Malaysia, my problem with the film would be over. But that wasn't exactly the truth. You see, Malaysia is a Muslim country, and Muslim law is about the strictest law in the world of today. They were frequently executing people by guillotine for trafficking drugs. These guards are here to protect the passengers at the train station. Once we transferred into Malaysia, I transferred over to the little island of Penang. Penang is very close to the mainland, and it's an international harbor, as you can see. Well, Penang is a beautiful little island. It's called the Pearl of the Orient. Georgetown is the only large city on Penang, and they have a few very beautiful beaches. At one beach called Batu Ferringhi, they had a couple of very nice hotels here. But I was living on a shoestring at that time, so I didn't stay in this hotel that night. And I didn't stay in this hotel that night. I stayed in this hotel that night. Worst night I ever spent in my life. You can usually stay in a little shantytown like this for about $1 a night. But don't let anybody ever talk you into it unless they also offer you a good mosquito net with no holes. I didn't get one that night, and this was me the next morning. Well, I rented a little motorcycle for my own tour of Penang. This island is so small that you can ride all the way around it in about a half a day, a whole day if you want to stop and see everything. Bunkers from the Second World War are common here. When the Japanese conquered Malaysia, they did the whole thing in a few days by bicycle. Well, Penang's really a religious melting pot. There are Muslim mosques, Christian churches, and Buddhist temples. The most impressive temple was the Temple of 10,000 Buddhas. There really are about 10,000 images of the Buddha here. In one room, only a kicking bag hung for the practice of martial arts. But most of the temple was exquisite. The most beautiful part was this big gold centerpiece. But the Hindu temples were really more impressive to me. Outside of every Hindu temple, you find 2 statues of Naga, the serpent. He's there on either side of the entrance to protect the ones inside worshipping and to keep the evil ones from entering. This modest-looking temple was the most impressive one to me. This was the snake temple. Green and yellow vipers everywhere inside. I wanted to film them outside in the sunlight so I could get better film. I found a guy out there with a couple of them. I asked him for a moment if I could hold his snakes while he held my camera and filmed them. He said okay, but to be very careful not to squeeze them because they're deadly poisonous. I asked him why I was holding them, and he said, well, not to worry about that. He said they're hypnotized by that thick incense inside the temple. It sort of puts them into a trance for a while. He told me it took him about a half hour outside in the fresh air before they really regained consciousness. I asked him how long his had been outside. He said, oh, about 45 minutes. This is a type of viper. Ever wonder what vipers look like? Well, Penang really lived up to its name, the Pearl of the Orient. We could have stayed here for weeks without becoming bored, but we had to get that film south. We had to go all the way to the island of Singapore, then somehow fly it home. Now this meant we had to take the West Coast Road or the East Coast Road on the Malay Peninsula. Now the West Coast Road would be a very comfortable highway, but there would be customs agents everywhere checking luggage. The East Coast Road probably wouldn't have any customs agents because very few people travel there. To get to the East Coast Road, you have to cross the Northern Thai Malay Road. A very dangerous thing to do. But then we could go down the East Coast and fly home. But the Thai Malay Road is dangerous. These are military outposts here to protect the road crews. They're trying to finish building the road here. The problem is that the communist insurgents are constantly shooting at the road crews. In the most dangerous areas, there will be a military outpost like this every half mile or so, and there will be guards, heavily armed soldiers carrying their M16s, walking about every 100 yards. If somebody shoots, they shoot back. Needless to say that the traffic and the cab drivers here waste no time getting through this area. This trucker had his tires shot out. He immediately walked to the nearest military outpost and came back later with soldiers. Once we got to this rubber plantation, I knew the danger was over. The plantation would never have existed back in the dangerous area. Rubber is the only cash crop that the British were ever able to grow here. The soil in Malaysia is so poor that they can't even grow rice. But the rubber thrives, and so does the jungle itself. A self-sustaining ecological system and very poor soil. If they ever do deal with their political problems and open the east coast of the Malay Peninsula up, it will probably become a tourist paradise. There are miles and miles of white sand beaches here without a footprint. And the people who live around here live the old Malay way, the way that they have for hundreds of years. Since the soil is so poor, very few people make their living from agriculture. Most of them make their living from the sea. The tropical waters here are just as abundant as they always have been. So the fishing techniques haven't really changed very much. They haven't had to. The farther south you go in Malaysia, the more modern the country becomes. These people work in a large city. They work in big office buildings, most of them, but this is how they arrive to work in the morning, on the water taxis. We're in the city of Malacca, Malaysia. The fishermen are untangling their nets for the day's work. The things I saw in Malacca reminded me of scenes conjured from a Dickens novel. The whole place looked like an oil painting. Malaysia is quite a melting pot of different people. Here's the typical Malay look. Big almond-shaped eyes and dark brown hair. And the women of Malaysia wear the sarong. The Malays are a combination of people from China who came together with people from India hundreds of years ago to create the Malays. The windy little roads remind one of a time when this was one of the first Dutch trading ports out here. Well, the place hasn't changed very much in those years. That boat must look about the same as it used to. And Malacca is still being used for the same purpose, trade. I found here what looked like the biggest bananas I'd ever seen in my life. I bought the biggest one I could find. I wanted to see what they tasted like. I soon found out that these are not really bananas, and you're not really supposed to eat them until you cook them first. This modest little mosque is the burial place of the Sultan of Johor, a very important person in history. The Sultan of Johor sold Singapore Island to Sir Sandford Raffles. He was a British mariner and an adventurer, and he was hired by the British to establish the first British trading colony out here. This was what old Singapore used to look like. They say that you used to be able to smell old Singapore when you were still 2 days out to sea if the wind was right. It was one of the filthy sin cities of Southeast Asia. That's right up until the Second World War. After that war, a Chinese man named Lee Kuan Yew took over here, and he managed to clean up old Singapore. His methods were brutal at times, but he managed to transform Singapore into one of the most modern and clean and safe cities in Southeast Asia. Old Singapore is hard to find anymore. It's being replaced by a very modern city. Everybody puts their laundry out the window on long wooden poles. They call these the international flags of Singapore. Well, my first trip here, I figured when in Singapore, I should do as the Singaporeans do. I no sooner got everything out the window there, though, and the floor manager knocked on my door. He said, "Mr. Howard, this is not what we do in the hotels. It's only for the public housing." He says, "Please, let us do your laundry." Well, it was 3 years later now, and I was returning, and I was amazed to see how much Singapore had grown in that 3 years. There were still parts of old Singapore to be found, but they were disappearing quickly. One part of old Singapore that I hope never disappears is the Raffles Hotel, built by Sir Sandford Raffles himself primarily for his friends. One of his good friends was the author and poet Rudyard Kipling. His friends said that they liked to come out here, but they couldn't keep staying in these bamboo huts, so he built them a hotel, a place where a European could come out here to Singapore and take care of business in a civilized way. Well, the Raffles Hotel is still being used for that purpose today. As a matter of fact, I was making many phone calls every day to the Philippines, trying to finalize the details on my underwater film job. I've learned that when you're in a place like this, and people speak English but with a strong foreign accent, sometimes certain English words sound a lot like other words. It can be very confusing and expensive over long-distance phone calls. Right across the street from the Raffles Hotel was Raffles City, or soon would be. There was just a foundation now, but eventually the largest hotel in Asia will stand right here. 80 floors high. It's probably completed very shortly because the road crews here, or the building crews, work day and night. Most parts of Asia you can sit around and watch the grass grow. In Singapore you can sit around and watch the buildings grow. The Singapore Polo Club. Many things in Singapore have a distinctively British feeling to them. That's because Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew was educated in England, and he has a very warm spot in his heart for the British way of life. He likes the Polo Club, and the changing of the guard at Lee Kuan Yew's palace was very much like the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace in England. But Lee is Chinese, and since he took over, he decided that neither the British nor any other Europeans were ever going to control Singapore again. He built some beautiful Chinese gardens here after he took over. Well, my package of film had arrived from the Philippines. There was nothing standing between me and my job there, except I stayed for another day or so to film a Hindu wedding that I had been invited by the family to videotape. This is the part of Singapore where the people of India come from. And the women of India wear what I consider to be the most beautiful feminine garment in the world, the sari. The Hindu women of India wear the spot on their foreheads. In some parts of India, a red spot means that she's married. In other parts, it's just there for the sake of fashion or tradition. Now here's an interesting sight. In many Hindu countries, these girls would not be playing together because one of them is of the upper class. You can tell by the way that they're dressed. But in Singapore, so many people have to live closely together here in peace that they've relaxed a few of their traditional customs. The music might sound a little bit sour to you. That's because they use a different musical scale in the East than we do here. Our music sounds just as strange to them. This is not a faith that demands little from its followers. The Hindus are literally praying all day, every day. There seemed to be a prayer connected to almost every daily duty of life, so while the wedding went on, many people came by the temple that day to take care of their daily religious responsibilities. Here's an interesting sight, a Chinese girl who's become a Hindu. She probably married a man from India. Well, finally the bride and groom arrived to take part in their own ceremony. They had many tasks to perform under the watchful eyes of their deities. One thing that I thought was kind of cute was that they wore their wedding rings on their toes instead of their fingers. Notice how much gold the bride is wearing today. That's because in the Hindu tradition of India, a wife is not entitled to inherit her husband's wealth if he leaves her or even if he dies. But the gold that she wears on her wedding day will always be hers. Nobody can ever take it away from her. So Hindu brides wear as much gold as they can on this day. Well, now there was nothing standing between me and that job in the Philippines. The next morning I was on a plane headed to the northeast, to the capital city of Manila. On the approach to Manila, I was looking out the window of the airplane and I saw what looked like giant wooden arrows down there in the water. They're actually bamboo fish traps, much larger than they look. Well, a half a day later, I was on a beautiful 120-foot motor yacht called the Lady of the Sea. We were on our way to 3 little islands called Panglao, Kapilao, and Bali. How are those for romantic names? The Lady of the Sea was the best dive boat in the Philippines. And I was very happy that they hired me to film underwater here, because the underwater world in the Philippines speaks for itself. This is a coral reef, a giant underwater living mountain. Not only the fish on the reef, but the reef itself is actually alive. And the fish that you find on the coral reefs of the world are the most colorful anywhere. This particular fish is called a Moorish idol. And Moorish idols like to pose for photographers. Have you ever wondered what the largest living thing in the world ever was? Dinosaurs maybe, or whales? No, it's the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. It's also the only living thing that you can see from outer space. This is a clownfish. Clownfish have a fascinating symbiotic relationship with a sea anemone. Now, that anemone, which looks like a big flower, can sting, but the little clownfish are immune to the stings. so they have a safe place to live and they attract food to their anemone. These two creatures need each other. There are many symbiotic relationships in the sea. It's a good thing that diver's wearing a glove because he's holding on to a piece of fire coral with that hand. Without a glove, you can get quite a chemical burn that way. We didn't dive very long that afternoon because primarily the Philippine Department of Tourism had hired me to film their underwater world at night, the nocturnal creatures that come out after dark. So after we checked out the diving and the camera equipment, we spent the rest of the afternoon on our boat, the Lady of the Sea, waiting for the sun to go down. The guy riding the sailboard there is Junie Binamera, our dive master. Every scuba diving boat in the world must have a dive master on board, an expert to sort of watch out for everybody. Well, Junie was an expert underwater, but he was just a beginner at windsurfing. It seemed that every time he got close enough to the boat to get off and take a rest, a gust of wind would come up and blow him a couple hundred yards off to the port or the starboard. It would then take him about a half an hour to work his way back to the boat. Here's Mike. Mike's the only member of the original crew here. Originally, this boat had been built by the British as a submarine chaser, but it never served. President Sukarno of Indonesia back in the 1960s liked the boat so much, he bought it as a gift for his wife. She used it for many years as her private yacht, until Sukarno lost power. Then a man from Hong Kong bought the boat and used it for many years to smuggle opium out of the Golden Triangle. Eventually, the boat was captured by the Philippine Navy, and everybody but Mike here was put in jail, and the boat was put up for auction. The Gloria Mira Scuba Diving Company bought it, so now it's the finest dive boat in the Philippines, with quite a story. Well, the sun was getting low now, and it was time for us to prepare for our night dive. The villagers from two little islands, Panglao and Kapilao, came out in their small boats to watch. They're fascinated with our lights underwater in the dark. Just before it got dark, Junie went out to find the edge of the reef so he could mark it with an underwater light, enabling us to find it after dark. Once the sun goes down in this part of the world, it gets very dark very quickly. A few minutes later, we were underwater, and that's the moon from about 30 feet down. You can see the stars down there too at night if it's clear enough. It's a different world underwater at night. These are organ pipe sponges, staghorn coral, actually, even during the day, the light spectrum is filtered out by the water. Once you get down to about 20 or 30 feet, red turns into sort of a brown, yellow will turn into kind of a pale green. So until we divers first came down here with our artificial lights, until that, even the fish didn't know what these things really looked like. But now with our lights, you can see that soft coral is about the most colorful living thing imaginable. There's a parrotfish sound asleep in his cave, but with no eyelids, even asleep, his eyes are wide open. A lionfish also sleeping, beautiful but very dangerous. Many lionfish are more venomous than cobras. They won't attack you, but if you brush up against one accidentally, those stingers all over his body will sting you. A feeding frenzy of hungry eels. Not dangerous, but kind of eerie down here this late at night. And finally, I had the film that caused the Philippine Department of Tourism to pay for me for the job and pay for this trip. After a typically beautiful Philippine sunrise, a few hours later, I was on my way back to Bali. It had been 5 years since I'd been here. On the final approach to Bali, I was so excited I could hardly contain myself. Bali hadn't really changed much in the last 5 years. It was amazing considering how much Singapore had changed in only 3 years. I wanted to see if any of my old friends still lived in Denpasar. I went to Wayan's house when I arrived there. Denpasar hadn't really changed that much. Seemed to be a few more people, but that was about the only change. Well, Wayan and his family still did live in the same house. He wasn't there that day, but his wife and older daughter were there. They told me that Yeoman would be down at Tanalot that day and I should go down and surprise her. When I arrived, she wasn't there yet, so I spent most of the morning photographing the temple. She was only 13 years old when I'd first seen her. Now she'd be 18. I was wondering if she had any new stories. I did. I think if I was a painter, I'd spend a whole lot of time right here. Finally, at about noon, she got there. She didn't seem to have changed all that much in the last 5 years. She told me that I had arrived this time during the time of the big surf. I have to admit that's a big part of the reason I came back at this time of year. It had been very frustrating not being able to try out the waves last trip. Well, to go surfing here, first you have to rent a surfboard. In Bali, this is not difficult. Many Australian surfers come over here, they run out of money, and they sell their boards to stay longer. And the Balinese rent them out. And the way you get your surfboard around in Bali is the way you get everything else around on the back of your bike. We were lucky that we ran into these Australian surfers. They knew where the trail to Uluwatu began. You can't drive all the way to the beach in Uluwatu. You have to walk for a mile or so down this jungle trail. Most of the best surfing beaches in the world are rather inaccessible, and most of them are not sandy. They're rocky beaches. Something kind of cute happened here. I think that Yeoman was anxious to prove to me that she was no longer a 13-year-old tomboy, so while I was running my surfboard, she changed out of her blue jeans into this dress. She had no idea that day that we were going to be hiking through jungles and climbing fences. She was a good sport, though. She kept up with everybody. She always had a big smile on her face, and if we ran into anybody, she was the only person who could translate. Most Balinese don't speak English. Well, we could see from the top of the cliffs that the surf was very good today. Well, for Yeoman and those who aren't actually going surfing, this is almost the end of the hike. They're going to take shelter under that roof from the hot sun. But for those of us who actually want to try the waves, the hardest part of the hike is still to come. You have to get down that cliff. And the easiest way down the cliff is not too easy. Once we get down, we're actually going to paddle out through this large open-top cave. The last step was the toughest. Well, during high tide, you can actually paddle out through this large opening. But that's only during high tide. Once you get to about where he is right now, you have to hop on your board and start paddling, because under him right now is very sharp coral, too sharp to walk on. So when the tide is high, you can do that, but when the tide drops, and that can happen very quickly here, then the only way to get to the surf is through these little holes. You have to sort of crawl out between waves. But once you've done all that, you find yourself in some of the finest surfing waves to be found anywhere in the world. A good surfing wave has to break from one side to the other like these, and the best ones are actually hollow inside so a surfer can get in there. That's the fastest and most exciting part of every wave, where every surfer wants to spend as much time as possible. Right in that tunnel called the curl. When you're inside a wave, it's called being tubed, or being in the barrel. When you're being tubed in a big wave, it feels as though you're in a tunnel being chased by a freight train. When you're in that tunnel, you're in a place that surfers call the green room. The idea is to get as far back as you can into that tunnel, and when the wave breaks, you power forward and somehow get out of the way before it snaps shut like a giant mousetrap. When there's two people on a wave, the guy in the front has to get out of the wave because the guy in the rear has right-of-way. Surfing etiquette, not honored everywhere. Well, around 3 or 4 in the afternoon, everybody on Bali bathes in the many sacred bathing ponds around here. You may have noticed by now that the word sacred is used quite a bit here. I was becoming more and more fascinated with this aspect of their lives. For example, out in the yard of our bamboo inn, there was a little spirit chair built right here in the bushes. The idea is that when they built the hotel here, they evicted the spirit of the land, so they have to give him a little chair to sit in every day. They make offerings to him every morning to keep him happy. Yeoman noticed that I was becoming more and more fascinated with this aspect of their lives, and she asked her father if she could give me a little tour of all the temples around here. Wyon said, of course, there's no way I could possibly understand them without being introduced to this aspect of their lives. So first she introduced me to Singhang Weedy. He really is God here, and all the other deities are just different parts of his power, like Ganesha, the elephant-headed god to whom they pray for wisdom, and Kali, the protector. The Barong, another protector of the human race. Then there's the evil witch queen Rangda. She's the satanic element in their religion. There's always a large Kali head above the entrance to every temple to protect the ones inside worshipping and to keep the Rangda and her evil friends from getting in. Togo. Togo guards all the waterways here, so you can always see a statue of Togo on the bridges that cross the rivers and streams in Bali. Even Sita, Rama's wife, has been deified, as have the many monkeys that were able to help rescue her from the evil god Tarsikan. Then there was just this whole pantheon of mythological creatures that I couldn't remember. But I was being introduced to everybody, and again I heard that familiar sound. Another one of those processions was passing. I had been wondering about this for 5 years. This time I was going to follow it for sure. This time I had a guide to help. Yeoman could explain. I asked her what that was, and she said, well, that's a cremation ceremony. I said, a cremation? You mean someone's died and they're going to cremate them? She said, actually, many people. This is the most festive and common occasion that they have on Bali. So we followed to watch. Yeoman told me that they only have a cremation ceremony when somebody wealthy dies. That's because these ceremonies are very expensive. Most people are just buried in sort of a temporary cemetery. They wait until somebody rich dies, and then they all dig up their relatives and join in. The idea behind that is that it's an honor to accompany an upper-class person on to the next world. These are all gifts that will accompany their loved one on. No gift can be too large or too small because they all come from the heart. Finally, the large towers of the Brahmins appear. These are the upper-class people. Now, we have a very interesting situation going on here. The priest is up there with the deceased. The body is up there with him, and he's talking to the deceased almost as though he's not really dead. You see, they don't really believe that he knows he is dead. They feel like he's a living spirit trapped with a dead body, very frightened and confused at this time. Well, his priest is up there talking to him just like an old friend, telling him not to worry, his friends and family are all here, and to follow that sheet. That's the path that he should concentrate on. Whenever you get to a crossroads or an intersection, they twirl the tower around and around. The idea behind this is that when the spirit is finally released in smoke during the cremation, he still might not realize he's dead. He might try to find his way back home. So you have to confuse him here at the crossroads so he'll go on to heaven where he belongs. The cremation will actually take place in the effigy of the bull here. The body will be transferred to the bull, and then the tower and the bull will all be burned. So I guess even the spirit of the bull needed a little bit of confusion here. One by one, the towers arrive in the cremation yard. The whole scene is accompanied by the constant music of the gamelan orchestra. Finally, the largest tower arrives, the tower of the Brahman from whom this whole ceremony was planned. Then there will be an hour of chanting and praying, accompanied by the sound of the Brahmins' bells. Notice that each person holds a coin in his fingers. This will be the last gift that will accompany the loved one on to the next world. Then the cremation took place. It didn't last very long, considering how long the ceremony had gone on. At about this time, Yeoman asked me a confusing question. She said, "Rick, are you angry?" At first I thought she might think I was offended by this, but I said, "Of course not, oh Yeoman. I'm getting beautiful film and we're in a beautiful place." We were in a beautiful place too, Ubud, in central Bali, where most of the artists live. Just about 100 years ago, when Paul Gauguin went to Tahiti to paint, many other European painters came here. Very artistic people that the Balinese are, they immediately picked up on this new art form, started painting their own pictures. Yeoman told me that she knew of a group of woodcarvers who lived near here, so we hopped on the bike and took off down this windy little Balinese road for the woodcarver's house. Yeoman told me that all Balinese are trained very early in the arts. Art is considered to be a very spiritual experience. The artists in Bali are treated the same way as the plumbers or the mechanics or the electricians. After all, what would the temples be without the stone carvers? Because of this, the Balinese receive very extensive training in the arts when they're young. Those who developed an aptitude for it make it a profession, so some of the finest art in Asia comes from this tiny island in Indonesia. It's a very inspirational place for an artist to live and work. I think there are more stone carvers in Bali than any other type of artist. After all, this is the island of 10,000 temples, and that's an underestimate. And the stone here is very soft and easy to carve. For this reason, the temples are constantly under state of repair. Most of their statues are the deities from their spirit world. People come from all over the world to buy these statues for $50 or $60, then they spend $500 or $600 to ship them home. Beautiful weavers, too. Yeoman and I were watching her weave that day, and again Yeoman asked me that confusing question. She said, "Rick, are you angry?" I said, "Yeoman, why would I be angry?" And she just shrugged her shoulders and said she didn't know, but she thought I might be angry. I didn't find out until a little later on what she was really talking about. I had noticed now, though, that my friend was no longer a 13-year-old tomboy. She had grown into a beautiful woman, which might make some of you wonder if there's more romance in this story than I'm telling you about. Well, not with a Balinese Hindu. No, the very strict way in which these people interpret their religion would prevent anything like that. It's not even acceptable here for married folks to show affection in public. Now, the only reason that we were allowed to travel around at all like this is because I had become an old friend of the family by now. It means a lot to an Asian family when you come back and see them after 5 years. They never thought they'd see you again. And sometimes they sort of adopt you. That's what had happened in my case. Now we were traveling around Bali to see all the brothers and sisters that I had met 5 years ago. We were on our way to Singaraja to see Yeoman's older brother, Wayan. We stopped on the way to the place where I had first met her, the Bat Temple. This place hadn't changed a bit. I wondered if any of them recognized me. Actually, bats don't really deserve their evil reputation. They're just little rodents that happen to be able to fly. And if it weren't for the bats in many parts of the world, the insects would take over. Even this big fruit bat, called a flying fox, is harmless to people. Finally, we arrived at Mount Agung, one of the 2 volcanoes that built Bali. And on the slopes of Mount Agung, you find the largest and most sacred temple on Bali, the Basaki Temple. You have to dress appropriately to enter a temple like this. You have to wear one of these. In this work of mine, I get many opportunities to visit places of worship all over the world. And with all the differences in the religions of the world, it seems that there's a few similarities that make the differences easier to understand. It seems that you're supposed to live a good life and not a bad life. You're supposed to treat your neighbor like your brother and worship God. If you do these things, you get a reward. If you don't, you don't. And these rules seem to be the same whether you're a Buddhist, a Muslim, a Hindu, a Christian, or a Jew. Understanding these similarities makes it easier to understand the differences. For example, many people believe that the Hindus worship many gods. Well, in a way it looks like they do, but not really. You see, all their gods are just different parts of the one pure God's personality and power. They call him Singhang Weedi here, and all the other deities are just different parts of his abilities. They worship the positive deities up in the high mountain temples near the clouds, and they worship the lower deities down in the lower parts, like under the ocean or under the ground. They ask the good deities for the positive things they want in life, and they ask the evil ones for the things that they want to avoid, like please stay away and leave me alone. The Balinese will go into the elephant cave to pray to the Rangda to please leave them alone, just as they'll ask the deities for the things that they want in life. Even beautiful Tanalot is dedicated to the lower deities because it's in a low place, the sea. Well, here was the most beautiful sacred bathing pond I saw in Bali, and when we got here, Yeoman asked me that confusing question again. She said, "Rick, are you angry?" I said, "Yeoman, you got to stop asking me that. Why would I be angry?" She said, "Well, I'm angry." I said, "What are you mad about?" She said, "I'm not mad, I'm angry. Everybody has to eat." This poor kid had been saying hungry all day, and it sounded like angry. Remember how I told you that a strong foreign accent can make many English words sound like other words? Well, that's how it works. After eating, we took off the rest of the way around Bali to Singaraja. Singaraja is in northern Bali. This was the Dutch capital here when the Dutch were in charge. On our way, we ran into a bit of history taking place. For the first time, they were paving the road around the island. Up until now, the road has been a dirt road, a trail in places. But now, for the first time, they're paving it. And as you can see, the paving techniques are a bit primitive here. But this is progress on Bali. It's also the reason that the roads are in such bad shape. But now, for the first time, most tourists can come up to the mountains and see the beautiful rice terraces. Rice terraces like this are common in many parts of Asia. Obviously, it's a way to grow rice, a crop that requires flat land on the side of a mountain. Each terrace will irrigate the one below it. But like everything else in Bali, even the rice terraces have a flair, an artistic flair to the way that they're designed.
Carry me home, where the trees and the sea and my little dog, we are all the same. Every flesh and blood, even rocks, they can sing your name. Me from anything, let me know it all. This is what I pray now.
The northern coastline of Bali is a lava flow. When we arrived, we found fingers of hardened lava rock reaching out into the sea. They hardened when the two volcanoes erupted. We arrived in Singaraja just before the sunset. Shipwrecks dot the coastline along here. Many of them are victims from the storms at sea, but some of them are actually victims from the bloody coup that took place back here in the 1960s, when President Sukarno was overthrown by President Suharto. He still rules Indonesia today, and this was the last time this was called Dutch Indonesia. Every communist or anybody with Dutch blood was either killed or banished at that time. This also marked the end of the foothold that the communist world was beginning to establish here back at that time. Well, Yeoman's older brother Wayan showed up early the next morning. He had been at a ceremonial dance all night, and when I saw him, he was still in his ceremonial outfit. This is his kris, a family kris. More than 100 years old, it's a family heirloom. It's longer than a knife, shorter than a sword, and filled with magic. The magic is in the carved winged lion and the pattern on the blade. It's created by hot metal folded over and over itself, creating a pattern that's as unique as a fingerprint. That's supposed to hold the power and the magic of the blade, and a kris is always kept in a wooden scabbard unless it's being used to protect the outside world from the very powerful magic of the blade. There was a tobacco plantation behind Yeoman's house. Tobacco is the only cash crop that the Dutch were ever able to grow here, so there's still a few big plantations in the north. The next day the sky was completely filled with kites, every different size, shape, and description. I found out that it's very important for a Balinese child to properly learn how to fly a kite at a young age. That's not a large kite by Balinese standards. Well, when you grow up in a jungle, learning to fly a kite is not the easiest thing in the world to do. But by the time they're a little older, they'll all have it mastered. Balinese children live a very interesting life. A Balinese baby is not allowed to touch the ground for the first 6 months of his or her life. That's because a baby is supposed to be too pure, having just been born, to be exposed to the evil ones under the ground. So he'll be carried around on the hip of an older sister or his mother for 6 months. Then he'll be lowered to the ground at that age with his family in a little ceremony. Once he's released, he'll be released to explore all of his village. The Balinese children become very worldly within their own village at a young age. They live a very communal life. She might wander into the neighbor's yard, and the adults there will take care of her as though she's one of their own until the end of the day. Then they'll just take her back home. The Balinese children have a lot to learn here about the spirit world and about the balance that they need in their lives. I wasn't able to find out what they were making here because Yeoman was inside visiting with her family and nobody here spoke English. This village is very remote. I'm probably the first Westerner that she ever saw before. That's because the road has just recently been finished past their village. They've had very little exposure, but now since the road is finished, more and more they'll be exposed to the outside world. Head along the north shore here, past the beautiful black sand beaches. The sand here is as black as coal, but when you touch it, it doesn't rub off on you. It's just black sand. Many temples with hundreds of monkeys in each one. Their eyes were fixed on your shirt pocket and their hands were out. As you can see, the road had to be blasted right out of the cliff here. The road building techniques here are much slower and more primitive than they are in our part of the world, so it took this long to finish the road around the island. Bushes ride bicycles on Bali. Well, finally we had arrived at the western tip of the island, where the ferries come in from Java. The only ways to get to Bali is to fly in as we did, or to take the ferry from Java, unless of course you own your own yacht. This is the dry side of the island. Something very interesting happened here. Yeoman's immediate family knew all about me, but not all the relatives in this part of the island. Every time I would stop to photograph something like this, I would see my friend was sitting down behind the motorcycle and hiding, not wanting to be seen traveling around with this strange Westerner, cause a family scandal. Even in Bali, people talk. These decorations are for the purpose of inviting the good spirits into the ceremony today and to scare the evil ones away. The Balinese believe that the good and the evil spirits are roaming around all day, every day. They're just invisible. Well, I was very grateful for this beautiful tour of the island, so I took Yeoman and her sisters out to a dance that night. A Balinese dance is not like one you'll find anywhere else in the world. They're really more of a little stage presentation than a dance. While the audience was arriving, they were being entertained by the gamelan orchestra just off stage. The first dance was the barong dance, and the first creature to appear is the barong. There he is. He's the hero of our story, the protector of the human race. And the villain in this story is the evil witch queen, Rhonda. There she is. Then there's the poor people, just sort of stuck in the middle between good and evil, somehow trying to get through the day. At first, the Rhonda will appear, usually assisted by a beautiful woman. Immediately, she'll start causing trouble for everybody. But you can usually dispense with evil at first, once you discover who she really is, much to the dismay of her evil helpers. But you can never permanently get rid of evil. She will always be resurrected by her evil helpers to come back and plague you again. This time, the Rhonda returns in the form of a beautiful woman to fool everybody. She gets away with her facade at first, until again she's discovered for whom she really is, and once again she's banished. But this time, before she leaves, she casts a spell. That's a spell. Finally, she returns in her own hideous form, and the only way to really get rid of her is through self-abuse. They take out their krises and they drive that razor-sharp point under their skin. Now, I got close enough many times to see that there's nothing phony about this. They really are doing what it looks like. They can also walk on hot coals in Bali without burning their feet. They claim that their spirits are protecting them during this time. Only when the barong comes out and tells them that the dance is over are they allowed to quit. Well, if the dances during the day are interesting here, after dark they become fascinating. Most of the most beautiful costumes come out after dark. Balinese dances usually go on until dawn. Those rapid eye movements are common only to Balinese dances. Every movement in a Balinese dance must be perfect. This is a Legong dancer. The most difficult dance to perform on Bali is the Legong. Legong dancers can only be upper-class teenage girls, young teenage girls. By the time she gets to be 17 or 18, she'll be too old to be a Legong dancer anymore. But for the rest of her life, she'll be remembered for these days, because every single movement must be perfect. This is a threat to all Balinese children. Their parents tell them that if they go out into the woods at night, this guy will find them and eat them up. The threat probably works. This is the kind of face I used to see in nightmares. Until at least about noon, but not to be the case, I was woken up by the army, the Indonesian army, on maneuvers with a sunrise. Friendly group of guys. But this same Indonesian army killed about 50,000 communists here back during that bloody coup in the 60s. Well, a group of Japanese tourists had just arrived and they were getting their traditional $1 massage on the beach. Most people do this the first day that they arrived. It's a good massage for $1. The surf had come up, so I rented a surfboard and went out and met 3 interesting people on the waves that day. Their names were David, and Kim. Now, Kim and David had been an Australian couple who had lived here for more than 10 years. There's Kim, and they had a young house guest, David Kennedy, who was a member of a prominent political family in our country. But at 19 years of age, Kennedy wasn't interested in politics. He was more interested in becoming a world-class surfer. There he is, and at 19 years of age, he was well on his way to his goal, a very good surfer. Well, these 3 asked me if I would like to see their secret surfing beach. I told them that I would, and they told me that as soon as we turned off the main road here, I was going to have to be blindfolded, so I couldn't tell any other surfers how to find their secret beach. Surfers all over the world are very protective of their good waves. The Balinese guy sitting down, Madej, is the one who insisted I wore the blindfold because I didn't live here and he considered these to be his waves. Well, the walk down to the beach wasn't as hard as Uluwatu. There's a road that leads all the way down to the waves here. And once we got down there, I got to see David, and Madej performing on these perfectly shaped, uncrowded Balinese waves. Watched Kennedy attempt a 360 and almost get away with it. The nicest way to film surfing is in slow motion. In slow motion, it looks like you're dancing with a wave. You just let the wave lead and you follow. Aussie Dave here has been surfing for more than half of his life. He makes a very difficult sport look almost effortless. We didn't get to surf for very long that afternoon because we had all been invited to a ceremony. Yeoman's younger brother Putu was having a coming-of-age ceremony today. When a Balinese girl reaches 13 years of age, she has a coming-of-age ceremony which will prepare her for adult life. Until that time, she's been considered a child, and after that time, she'll be ready for marriage. The Balinese women mastered this balancing act hundreds of years ago. It was very impressive to the European explorers. Still pretty impressive today. We were all on our way to Wayan's house for the ceremony. The ceremony was already in progress when we arrived. Everybody was waiting for the Brahman to appear. There's Yeoman's older sister. She went through the same ceremony about 10 years ago, and Yeoman went through it about 5 years ago. Now it's Putu's turn. Putu is actually in solitude. She's been meditating and praying for about 48 hours, alone, to purify herself for this ceremony. Finally, the Brahman appears. He will conduct the ceremony. A Balinese Brahman cannot marry until he's 65 years of age. Sort of makes you wonder what's the point. Finally, Putu appears. She'll be carried to the family shrine on the shoulders of a male member of her family. That's because she's considered to be too pure at this time to be exposed to the ground where the evil ones dwell. This was caused by her time in chanting and praying to purify herself for this ceremony. Putu will go through this ceremony today with a couple of her friends. The 3 girls that are going to have the ceremony all grew up together. They're about the same age, and by having their ceremony at the same time, they can help their families to defray the cost. These ceremonies are expensive by local standards. My friend Wayan was standing behind me right now with big tears rolling down his cheeks. Proud day for Papa. Just as proud as the day when she'll marry. Funny thing happened, just about the time the Putu ceremony was ending, I heard another familiar sound. Another cremation ceremony was passing. And the amazing thing is that after Putu's ceremony ended, most of the people there went out and joined into the cremation, and their mood didn't change a bit. I was really beginning to realize that this is a happy ceremony for them. After all, they say he'll just be reincarnated anyway. And the Balinese believe that the place that you wait to be reincarnated is just like Bali. The only difference is there's no disease, no poverty, no problems. It would be nice to feel that way about the island on which you lived your earthly life. The person who's died is a very beloved Indonesian general. That mirror will help the general see into the future. The general is the man primarily responsible for ousting the communists here back during that bloody coup in the 60s. When somebody of this stature dies, his family members are actually carried to the cremation yard. Again, by getting them up off the ground here, they're getting them a little bit closer to the spirit world, sort of enabling them to take this last walk with their grandfather. The effigy of the bull is very large to suit the fame and the position of the general. Well, there he is. Now again, his priest is up there with him, talking to him just as though he's an old friend who doesn't really realize he's dead. He tells him not to worry, to follow that sheath. That's the path he should be concentrating on. All of his friends and family are here. Some of these larger towers take up to 100 pallbearers or more to carry them. It's considered quite an honor to be a pallbearer in one of these ceremonies. That swastika there is not a German insignia. It was a Hindu symbol thousands of years before Hitler came along. Well, after a short ceremony, the cremation took place. I was actually amazed that they wanted me to get this close and shoot these close-up shots. After all, they said, we're doing all this to honor the old general. Me filming him and showing people all over the world really just honors him more. About 40 people joined into the ceremony that day, 40 deceased people. So the funeral pyres on the beach that night looked like a burning necklace. Once the fires burn down, the children will come out to look through the hot coals for anything that might be left, pieces of jewelry. That's because tomorrow the ceremony will really end. The finally remaining pieces will be taken down to the beach and launched off into the sea. The old general has gone full circle now. You see, the Hindus believe that life is a circle. You live a life, you die, you're reincarnated, you live another life and die, and this pattern goes on and on until finally you live enough lives, or good enough lives, to get out of the treadmill of reincarnation onto heaven, as we call it. These people feel that now the old general may be reincarnated as a member of his own family, a granddaughter or a grandson. And if this does happen to be the last incarnation, he'll now go on to heaven, but he'll remain in constant contact with his family. He'll be a spirit. His family will continue to honor him here on earth, and he'll watch over them from where he is. And when it does come time for them to die, he'll welcome them on to heaven. You see, that's one of the essence of Balinese life. They believe that the life we live here is very closely connected to the life after. They're really just like two sides of the same coin, and they must be kept in constant balance. The Balinese have to take things on faith, but I have noticed that there does seem to be an amazing balance here. Not only a balance between the spirit world and the real world, but also a balance between an ancient culture and an encroaching modern culture. So in an often violent and deadly world, there seems to be a serenity here. Bali is by far the most exotic island that I've ever visited. Well, from Yeoman, and David and Kim, and all the Balinese and myself, I'd like to thank you for visiting Bali with me. Terima kasih, I'll see you next time, and good night. Well, Rama was supposed to inherit a kingdom, but due to some inter-family squabbling, Prince Rama, his wife Sita, and his younger brother were all banished to the forest. To make matters worse, once while Rama and his brother were out hunting for a deer, Sita was captured by an evil god named Tarsikan, taken off to the island of Sri Lanka. Well, the Ramayana story is about how an army of monkeys led by one magic monkey named Hanumani were able to rescue Sita and kill the evil god Tarsikan. These monkeys on Bali are supposed to be direct descendants from Hanumani's army, so they let you know right away when you arrive here that you're a guest here and they own the place. They like to nap in the shade. If you give them a chance, they'll steal anything that they can out of your shirt pocket, like your cigarettes or sunglasses. If this happens, there's only one way to get it back. You buy a bag of peanuts and put one peanut on the ground. The monkey will pick it up. Then you put 2 peanuts down. He'll pick them up. Eventually, you'll put down enough peanuts that he'll have to put down whatever he stole, and you grab it. Believe me, that's the only way to do it. It wasn't long before I realized that even if I had had all the actors and actresses in Hollywood to choose from, I still could never have cast a film better than with this group. They were all young and full of adventure. If there was a mountain to climb or a jungle to explore, they wanted to. All I had to do was follow them for 2 weeks and film them. The first place I followed everybody was to where they were all living, a place called Kuta Beach, for some very inexpensive hotels. Torrential rains like this will start and end in a matter of moments all over Bali. Most people just look for cover. Around 3 or 4 in the afternoon, everybody here takes a siesta. It gets them out of the hottest part of the day. In the next few weeks, we became fascinated with the Balinese people. They have a very interesting lifestyle. Many of them make their living from the sea, or they grow 3 rice crops a year. If you're the firstborn in a Balinese family, your name is Wayan. If you're the second-born, your name is Made. Third-born, your name is Yeoman. And fourth-born, your name is Katuk. And if you're the fifth-born, you go back to Wayan again. That's whether you're a boy or a girl. So obviously there are a lot of Balinese with the same first names. There are many hidden dangers here. When you step off the plane in a place like this, you smell the fragrant flowers and feel the warm air, and it might lull you into a false sense of security. You can ignore the dangers, but I'm going to introduce you to a few of them here. One danger is the friendly-looking little dogs that will walk up to your table at the outdoor restaurants anxious to beg table scraps. But don't be fooled, these are not the dogs from back home. Hunger is a problem all over Asia, and anytime people have a problem, their animals have that problem worse. These dogs really live a life of combat with each other here at night. But no sooner you see something like this that will shock you, you can turn your head and see something else that will enchant you like this. Like the first time that I saw one of these processions. Many of them were carrying a sheet high above their heads. And the whole group was being followed by a little musical group called a gamelan orchestra. I wanted to follow and see where they were all going, but we were already on our way to the Bat Temple, so I was outvoted by my friends. Animals are sacred to the Hindus. The Hindus believe that every animal has a soul and therefore an equal right to life. In many Hindu countries, cows are considered to be reincarnated people. But at this particular place, the bats are sacred because this is the Bat Temple. Naturally, it's in front of the Bat Cave. Now, since they're sacred, nobody bothers them, so they don't mind if I walk right up and get these close-up shots. That squeaky sound that you hear is their sonar system. They emit that high-pitch impulse and it bounces off of hard objects. Then they catch it back in their radar dish-shaped ears. This enables them to fly in the dark without running into anything. At the Bat Temple that day, I met somebody that I knew back from Kuta Beach. I had met a guy back there named Wayan. He had a family of 5 daughters and 1 son. Well, Yeoman, his 13-year-old daughter, was at the Bat Temple that day. She told me that if I would give her a ride back home, she would tell me an interesting story about this salt village on the other side of the road from the Bat Temple. This is one of the villages where they collect salt for the other Balinese villages. Bali is a very communal existence. Well, Yeoman turned out to be quite a storyteller. She's 13 years old, and she told me that back when this was Dutch Indonesia, the Dutch missionaries had quite a problem here, people all over this area. Not the only way to get around, though. The most fun way of getting around is to rent one of the little Japanese motorcycles here. They're very inexpensive, and they're everywhere. But to ride a motorcycle here, first you have to get an Indonesian driver's license. For riding bikes, that's not the hardest thing in the world to do. All he has to do to get his license is to stay inside the circle and not put his foot down. He really had no trouble getting his license, though. The bottom line is that if you're willing to pay for your license, they'll test you until you pass. Actually, this causes a very dangerous situation here. You have many very inexperienced motorcycle riders out on these roads crashing into each other and everything else in sight. You notice that the riders are squeezed off to about 3 feet on the left side of the road there. and nobody in Bali ever seemed to dress appropriately for motorcycle riding. They used to call Bali the island of 10,000 temples. Actually, 50,000 would be closer to the truth. Everywhere you turn on this island, you see one of these ancient Hindu temples. We're going to the only offshore temple in Bali, the Temple of Tanah. Tanah's a beautiful temple with a mythological serpent that's supposed to live underneath it. I was very lucky at Tanah. I ran into a group of Australians who had just arrived here from the land down under. They were taking their own little tour of the temples. I followed them south to the southern Bali to the high cliff temple of Uluwatu. Uluwatu is not only the site of this beautiful temple, it's also the site of some of the finest surfing waves to be found anywhere in the world. The Australian surfers discovered them first. Soon the word got out and surfers were arriving from everywhere. As soon as we entered this temple, I thought it was deserted until the locals started showing up. It turned out that there were hundreds of monkeys living here. They started coming out in pairs to meet us. I met an old Balinese guy there that day who told me the story of why all the monkeys in Bali are sacred. There he is. And he said long ago there was a prince named Rama. Hello, I'm Rick Howard, and I've been making these travel adventure documentaries for quite a few years now, and most of the work has been done on tropical islands. Well, the most beautiful exotic island that I've ever visited is the island of Bali in Indonesia. My first trip to Bali, I spent 2 weeks, and I found out that 2 weeks on Bali is a little bit like seeing the first 10 minutes of a good movie and missing all the rest. You always wondered what you missed. I knew that someday I was going to have to return there and finish the job, but I didn't know that it would take me 5 years to work my way back. So as well as a story centered on Bali, you're going to see some of Hong Kong, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and the Philippines, all in this 5-year story that I call The Real World of Bali. The aerial approach to Hong Kong is one of the most beautiful in the world, so the pilots will usually fly you all the way around the island before landing. It gives everybody a chance to see everything. When you land, you realize you've entered a very watery world of boats. That little boat there is called a sampan. These are the water taxis that transport people all over this area. They have so much water around here that they have more water taxis than the four-wheel kind. Victoria Harbor separates Hong Kong Island from the Kowloon Peninsula. Hong Kong is one of those places in the world where the old world and the new come together. You can be in many parts of downtown Hong Kong and you might think that you're in San Francisco or London or any other international city. That's until you look up one of the windy little roads in the old Wan Chai district and you can see the way Hong Kong has looked for about a century. But even when you look to the skyline in Wan Chai, you can always see the new city growing. The most impressive place to see Hong Kong from is from up on top of Victoria Peak. You can get quite a view of the whole city from up here. This was only my first stop on my way back to Bali, so the hustle and bustle of downtown Hong Kong was a little bit too much for me that day. I crossed the island to Aberdeen Fishing Village. Aberdeen is a fascinating world within a world, an entire floating community. The people here live on these large junks, and the little sampans provide transportation between them. Many of these junks go down fishing off the coast of Vietnam every year. They not only bring back fish, some of them bring back refugees, and some of them bring back opium from the Golden Triangle. The smuggling of opium is a big problem here. Quite a bit of it takes place through Aberdeen. That's because it would be virtually impossible to ever try to search these junks. That's the largest floating restaurant in the world. They have 3 of them here in Aberdeen, and this one, the Jumbo, is the biggest. Actually, it's many restaurants in one. But even the hustle and bustle of Aberdeen was a little bit too much for me that day. I decided to see the sunset at a place called Repulse Bay, the site of a Buddhist shrine. While I was watching the sunset, my imagination took me back about 5 years into the past and about 2,000 miles to the south, past the Philippines, Vietnam, over the large island of Borneo, to the tiny island of Bali in Indonesia, right next to the larger island of Java. My first visit here, on my final approach, I found that the airport seemed to have been cut right out of the coral reef. When we landed, like most tourists, I was immediately hustled across the island to the most expensive hotels at a place called Sanur Beach. Beautiful 5-star hotels offering whatever a tourist could possibly want. 18-hole golf courses, water sports. But I was living on a shoestring at that time, so I caught a little vehicle called a BMO, headed for Denpasar, the capital city, looking for less expensive lodging. That's a BMO. They're the little golf cart-sized buses that transport